Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Clara always believed stability was a form of love. She grew up hearing that a long-lasting marriage was the biggest sign of success. And at 48, there she was, with a tidy house, a present husband, independent kids, and a spotless record of marital loyalty. Everything in place. Everything working. Everything empty. The silence in the house wasn't new. It had crept in slowly, between conversations about bills, dinners ready on time, and automatic good-night kisses. She remembered when Daniel used to make her laugh in the middle of the supermarket. Now, they barely exchanged full sentences. Sometimes he'd ask questions while fiddling with his phone, as if he were just going through the motions of being married, without actually listening to the answer. Other times, he'd just mutter something about work, his back pain, or the dishes left in the sink. And she, in turn, had also stopped trying. There wasn't a specific moment when everything cooled down. It was years of small surrenders, promises left for later, touches that lost their meaning. The kids grew up, moved out, and the too big house started to echo. When she was alone, Clara filled the space with old music, just to remind herself what it felt like to hear something that stirred emotion. The marriage wasn't bad. But it wasn't good either. It was a kind of silent agreement where no one questioned anything anymore. They still slept together, yes, but each on their own side of the bed, as if they belonged to different planets. There were times when she'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember the last time she truly cried or laughed. She'd run her fingers over her arm, searching for some reaction, some shiver, anything to confirm she was still alive. At work, Clara followed the same routine she'd had for years. A research assistant at the university library, she organized files, helped lost students, and delivered documents to professors. She knew exactly where every book was. She recognized the regular visitors. She was efficient, polite, invisible. Her co-workers respected her, but no one ever invited her to lunch or events. And she didn't expect it anymore. She had the same milk coffee at the cafeteria, read the same reports, and smiled at the same distracted students. Sometimes she'd see girls in their 20s laughing loudly in the hallways and feel a mix of nostalgia and distance. It was like watching her own youth from the sidelines, from far away, with a bitter sense that she hadn't made the most of it. When she got home, Daniel was usually watching TV or reading something on his tablet. They'd replaced eating dinner together with quick meals at different times. She no longer cooked with joy. She prepared the basics, just enough. And he'd praise her without looking. It's good, and thanks, and that was it. There was no desire in the air anymore. Once, while cleaning out the bedroom closet, Clara found a box of old letters. They were little notes she and Daniel had exchanged in the early years of their marriage. Small pieces of paper with sweet messages, silly drawings, promises of an amazing future. She read each one with tears in her eyes. Not because she missed him, but because it felt like those words had been written by two people who no longer existed. She once suggested a weekend trip, a different outing, any attempt to breathe in a new kind of air. Daniel dodged it. Said they were fine like this, that tiredness was normal at this stage of life, that there was no reason to shake things up. And she swallowed it. Like she had so many times before. The days turned into repetitions. Birthdays were celebrated with formal messages and generic gifts. Important dates were forgotten or treated like just another item on the schedule. Clara even wondered if the problem was her, if she had done something wrong. She tried changing her haircut, bought new clothes, started walking around the neighborhood. But it all seemed pointless. It was like screaming into a well. At some point, she stopped trying to change. She started accepting. Pretending everything was okay was easier than facing the frustration of realizing it wasn't. She adapted to the silence, the shallow conversations, the cold touches. But deep inside, deep down, a discomfort kept growing. A part of her kept reminding her that life was more than just surviving next to someone. Clara wasn't unhappy all the time. She had just forgotten what it felt like to truly be alive. It was as if the brightness of her days had been drained, leaving only neutral tones. She kept functioning, fulfilling her duties, being a quiet wife and an efficient professional. But she didn't dream anymore. She was afraid to admit, even to herself, that love no longer lived there. Because admitting that meant facing the emptiness, the age, the time that had passed. And she didn't know if she had the strength to start over. That's why she preferred to keep busy with daily routines, small tasks, library books. That way, she didn't have to think. That way, she didn't have to feel. It was in this silent numbness that Clara kept living for months, maybe years. Accumulating inside her questions she avoided saying out loud. Is this really all I have left? Is it too late to change? Am I asking too much by wanting to be seen, touched, heard? Those questions had no answer. Or maybe they did, but she wasn't ready to face them yet. And so, every day, she put on her uniform, slipped on her shoes, and went to the university like someone serving a sentence. She knew where every book was. But she no longer knew where her own soul was. And it was right at that point, at the edge between habit and exhaustion, that something started to change. But that comes later. She was organizing some volumes of contemporary literature when she heard a different voice asking about an author almost no one mentioned. Clara pointed to the right shelf without looking up from the papers in her hand, but the voice insisted with another, more specific question. Then she lifted her eyes. The man was wearing a visitor's badge and holding a notebook full of scribbles. He seemed distracted, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Clara hold his gaze longer than she was used to. It was Julian Carter, the new visiting professor from the humanities department. He had a subtle accent, maybe from the north, a gentle way of speaking, and a presence that didn't fill the room with arrogance, but with curiosity. He thanked her for the help and, before leaving, mentioned how rare it was to find someone who knew that author. Clara smiled without thinking. A simple gesture, but one that made her face feel strange, like her muscles were remembering a forgotten function. In the following days, he showed up more often. Sometimes he was looking for a specific book. Other times, he just started a conversation. He spoke lightly, with subtle humor and a respect that made Clara feel at ease. It was different from the rushed interactions with the other professors. Julian had time. Or at least made it seem like he did. During one of those conversations, he asked how long she'd been working there. Clara answered, a bit shyly, that it had been over 20 years. He smiled and said that meant she was the silent guardian of the university's knowledge. She laughed, surprised by his choice of words. Then she thought about it for hours. From then on, his presence began to shape her day. Just seeing him arrive in the lobby or hearing his voice in the hallway would send a strange warmth through her chest. It was a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Something she thought was long gone, buried under the years, resurfaced without asking permission. And she didn't fight it. Julian talked about poetry like he was talking about life. He liked quoting book passages, telling travel stories, and asking what Clara thought about this or that. And she found herself responding with enthusiasm, opening internal drawers that had been closed for a long time. He listened with genuine interest, as if every word she said mattered. One day, he showed up with 2 coffees in hand. Said he'd thought of her while passing by the cafeteria and decided to take a chance. She accepted. They sat at a table in the back of the library. They talked for almost an hour, forgetting about life, time, and the stacks of paperwork. When he left, she held on to the coffee cup for a few more minutes. Just to stretch out that feeling. At home, Clara started looking at herself differently in the mirror. Not with vanity, but with curiosity. She began wearing earrings she hadn't touched in years. Started putting on lipstick before leaving. Picked her clothes more carefully. All of this quietly, without explaining anything to anyone. It was something just for her. There was a day when, by chance, they met at the same cafe near campus. He was sitting with a book open on the table and called her over. They talked. They laughed, shared memories, confessed small pains. He said he'd divorced 5 years ago, never had kids, and had grown tired of the loneliness that came with routine. She didn't say much about Daniel, but enough for Julian to understand there was a much deeper absence than met the eye. On the way out, he walked her to her car. Before opening the door, he stayed silent for a few seconds. She looked at him, waiting for something. He just smiled and said he liked talking to her because he felt at home. Clara got home with her heart racing. There had been no kiss, no touch. But there was something even more dangerous: connection. That feeling that someone saw what no one else did. The meetings started happening more often. Small escapes between shifts, conversations in the cafeteria, short text messages. Until one day, Julian walked into the library without looking for a book. He walked straight to her and said he needed to show her something. Clara followed. They went to an annex building where he used a room as a research base. There, for the first time, the silence between them was more intense than any words. She leaned her bag against the chair, and he slowly stepped closer. The touch came simply, directly, like the waiting was finally over. And there, in that hidden space, Clara felt alive in a way she couldn't remember being possible. It wasn't just about desire. It was about presence. About being touched with attention, kissed with intention, welcomed with warmth. When he held her afterward, without saying anything, her eyes filled with tears. Because someone was finally holding her like they wanted to stay. In the days that followed, the world seemed more colorful. She arrived at work with a different energy. She'd run her hand through her hair before walking in. She'd smile remembering the messages he sent. Julian had that power, turning the ordinary into something special. With him, Clara discovered another version of herself. One who still felt, still desired, still was desired. And that, in itself, was a revolution. Even knowing this was outside real life, even understanding the risks, she kept going. Not because she wanted to destroy anything, but because she felt there was something too real to ignore. Julian didn't promise anything. And she didn't ask. It was an unspoken agreement between two adults who met at an unexpected moment. And even though she tried to keep this new world separate from the old one, the line between them began to blur. And what came next, not even Clara was ready to face. She was at home, sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing some department articles. It was late afternoon, her phone charging beside her, a glass of wine resting next to the laptop. Clara didn't usually get distracted by her phone, but that day, between one break and another, she typed something to Julian. A light comment, with intimate words, like they often exchanged. She wrote without thinking too much. A small secret between two bodies that recognized each other outside their normal world. The message was short, but clearly carried a tone of desire. A code between them. She hit send and went back to her papers. It took less than 2 minutes for her stomach to freeze. The name that appeared in the chat right before Julian's was Daniel. The same Daniel who shared her house, the bills, the silence. The same one who at that very moment was in the bedroom, watching TV. She dropped everything and grabbed her phone. Checked. And there it was. The message. Every word sent to the wrong person. She stayed frozen for a few seconds. Her body felt locked. She tried to delete it, tried to cancel it, but it was too late. The read receipt appeared. Seconds later, she heard the sound of the bedroom door. He passed by her without saying a word and left the house. Took the keys and drove off. Clara stayed there, eyes fixed on the hallway. The glass of wine remained full. When Daniel came back, he walked in with a heavy expression and sat down in the living room chair. She approached slowly and asked if he wanted to talk. He answered calmly, without raising his voice. Said he'd read the message, that he understood everything in just a few words. Then he said something that broke her apart. I knew we had drifted apart, but I didn't think you'd be the first one to leave. There was no anger. No accusation. Just sadness. A mature, restrained sadness. Like someone holding a fragile object, knowing it's going to break anyway. Clara tried to explain. She talked about loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, the silence between them. She said Julian was a consequence, not the cause. Daniel listened to everything. He only interrupted once, to say she didn't need to justify herself. That he understood. In the days that followed, they shared the house like two polite strangers. They ate at different times. Avoided crossing paths in the hallway. Slept in separate rooms. Neither of them yelled, made a scene, or looked for someone to blame. It was as if the end had been accepted, but neither knew what to do with it. Clara cried alone in the bathroom. She thought about the years they'd built together, the nights they'd shared fears, the children they'd raised. She thought about the Daniel who used to make her laugh in the middle of the night, the man who held her hand during the second child C-section, the partner who decorated the house for her 30th birthday. She thought about it, and it hurt. But it also hurt to remember how everything had faded. How they'd become roommates inside a marriage. How they started treating each other with a formality that seemed to hide the emptiness. She didn't try to erase Julian from the equation. He existed. He was real. And she couldn't pretend that feeling hadn't come alive. But that hurt too. Because understanding her love for Julian didn't lessen the pain of losing Daniel. On a quiet afternoon, they sat in the living room and started talking. 4 hours. They spoke about both their mistakes, about everything that had been stuck in their throats for years. Daniel admitted he also felt invisible, that he was exhausted, that he'd thought about leaving, but stayed out of fear. Fear of failure, of judgment, of emptiness. Clara said she'd often tried to rekindle something between them, but felt like she'd become invisible. That her attempt seemed to go unnoticed. That she no longer felt like a woman in that marriage. It was a hard conversation, but honest. There was no energy left to fight. Just a mutual desire to understand. And maybe, to forgive. Daniel decided to leave the house for a while. Said he needed space. Clara respected that. She needed it too. Both understood their relationship had ended long before the affair. The message was just proof of what they'd both been feeling for years but hadn't had the courage to say. Clara started sleeping alone without guilt, but with the weight of deep sadness. She began therapy. She distanced herself from Julian for a few days. She needed silence. Not out of shame. But to find answers that didn't come from outside. This was the phase when she began to understand that the pain of a marriage ending wasn't measured by who was at fault, but by everything that went unsaid. Everything swallowed down to maintain the appearance of a stable life. And in that quiet grief, she began to feel something different. A desire to live without hiding her own wants. Even if it came at a high cost. Because deep down, Clara knew the biggest betrayal she'd committed wasn't against Daniel. It was against herself. 2 years had passed since the separation. Clara and Daniel settled everything calmly, respectfully, with a kind of pain that doesn't scream, but stays. The divorce was finalized, assets divided, and the kids informed. The older daughter, Megan, 26, called the same night to check if her mom was okay. They cried a little, talked about fresh starts, and Clara said she was ready. Evan, the younger one, stayed silent for days before sending a message saying he just wanted her to be happy. Her relationship with Julian also ended. Without drama. Without a scene. It faded slowly, like a light dimming. Their meetings became less frequent, conversations shorter. He received an offer to teach at another university and accepted. Said he needed new air, new inspiration. Clara didn't stop him. Their goodbye happened at a cafe near campus. A long hug, a kiss on the cheek, and "take care of yourself." And that was it. Clara stayed alone. She reorganized her life. Got involved in small projects, started giving occasional classes, found purpose helping other women who also felt forgotten in their own homes. She avoided thinking about Julian, not out of bitterness, but as a promise to herself. Her new life wouldn't have room for things that slowly caused pain. Daniel, in turn, started over at a different pace. He bought a smaller house, started playing tennis again on weekends, reconnected with old friends. Clara heard he'd started dating someone, but it didn't bother her. She just wished him peace. Until one seemingly ordinary Saturday, the phone rang. It was Megan. She was excited, her tone light, cheerful. She said she wanted to stop by her mom's that same day to introduce someone special, her new boyfriend. "Mom, you'll love him, he's smart, kind, and obsessed with literature. He's just like you." Clara smiled without thinking much and said she'd be waiting. The doorbell rang in the late afternoon. Clara opened the door with a small smile and froze. It was Julian. Standing next to Megan. His eyes widened, and a mix of shock and discomfort passed through Clara's gaze. Megan's expression changed instantly, as if she'd sensed something in the air she didn't understand. The three of them stood in silence for a few seconds that felt eternal. Julian was the first to try to cover it up. He extended his hand, forcing a smile and a rehearsed formality. "Clara, long time." She responded with a brief nod, almost mechanical. Megan frowned, confused, and asked straight out. "You two know each other?" Clara took a deep breath and kept her tone steady. "Yes. A while back, he worked at the university." The answer was short, sharp, like she didn't want to keep talking about it. Megan nodded, unaware that behind those words lay a much deeper story. They walked in, and the atmosphere stayed heavy, despite their attempts at conversation. Julian complimented the apartment, Megan talked about her new job, and everything felt like an awkward performance of a dinner that shouldn't have happened. At one point, Julian stood up and said he'd go to the corner store to buy some wine and a snack. As soon as he left, Megan turned to her mom. "Mom, what was that? You know Julian, right? Obviously you do. You've been acting weird since we opened the door." Clara took a deep breath. She thought about lying. Thought about skirting around it. But she gave up. She looked her daughter in the eye and said, "Yes, I do. And I need you to listen. He's not just someone who worked at the university. He was my lover." Megan froze. Her eyes filled with tears before any words came out. "What do you mean? Are you kidding me? This is serious?" Clara nodded. Her voice didn't shake. It was an old pain, but one she'd moved past. She said Julian was part of a complicated chapter in her life. That it was because of him her marriage with Daniel ended. That back then, she felt invisible and found in Julian someone who saw her as a woman. But the price was high. And even though it was all buried now, seeing him there, next to her own daughter, felt like reopening a wound that had already scarred over by force. Megan stood up, confused, trying to figure out what to do with that information. Said she needed time. She left the apartment before Julian even came back. In the weeks that followed, Clara didn't hear from either of them. Until one day, she got a message from Julian, "I want to talk." "I didn't know." "I'm sorry." Clara read it and took a long time to reply. But when she did, she was direct, "Please, don't contact me again." There was no anger. Just deep exhaustion. A boundary. A decision. A few months later, Megan came back. Said she'd broken up with Julian. That it was hard, confusing, but she couldn't keep going knowing the truth. Apologized for disappearing. Said she needed space to process everything. Clara welcomed her with a long hug, but didn't say a word. It was a pain they both now carried. Life went on. Without Julian. Without attempts to reconnect. Clara kept up with her projects, her classes, her mindful choices. Daniel continued his life with peace. The kids, in time, realized life is made of breaks and rebuilds. And Clara, for the first time in many years, carried no guilt, no longing, no ghosts. Just the certainty that living takes courage. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is closing a door and keeping on walking, even when your heart wants to look back. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.